Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Chip Fleischer, a senior editor at Steerforth Press, and I'm joined today by three authors who are on our list for spring 2026, and they have all written first-person narratives, and I'll use that term instead of memoir simply because they're three very different books by three very different authors. But there are some qualities that tie them all together, and in particular, it's the substantial literature that all three of the books represent. Even though I have read all three of the manuscripts for these books going back many months, almost every day something comes to mind from one of these manuscripts, if not more than once a day, that reminds me of things that I learned in these books about the world around us. Insights into the human condition, and vivid stories that appear in each of these books. And we are joined today by Francesca Fontana, who is a Wall Street Journal reporter based in New York, originally from Chicago and Oregon. Jowita Bydlowska, who is a Toronto-based memoirist, novelist, and journalist, originally from Poland. And Maria Milland, who is joining us from Copenhagen. And Maria is an OBGYN who has also done an extraordinary amount of humanitarian work over the years and is a first-time author. So we're going to be hearing from each of the authors based on when their books are going to be appearing. Francesca's is coming out in February, Jowita's in March, and Maria's in April. And so I have asked each of them to give you a brief introduction to their books and themselves. So Francesca, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Chip. Like he said, I'm Francesca Fontana. I'm the author of The Family Snitch. And my book really started with a simple premise, which was the question, why did my dad go to prison? So when I was 9 years old, my father, Al, went to federal prison, and I was never told why. Um, my mom, who was my primary caretaker, didn't know, and his family, who I was a little sort of close to, they kind of swept it under the rug. And so it remained this big gaping hole of a mystery about my dad, who was already sort of a mysterious figure in my life. And while he was in prison, my mom moved us across the country from Chicago, where we all were from, to Oregon. And I figured that this would just always be this unanswered question. And as I grew up, I kind of tried to make my peace with that. But then when I went to college at the University of Oregon, I studied journalism, and I got the tools to hunt the truth down myself, including access to Pacer, where I can access federal court records. And so I found out in my research that my dad had helped crooked cops rob drug dealers, which is a sort of quintessentially Chicago story. And so I could have ended the search there, but there were so many more questions that brought up. For instance, who had my dad been when he wasn't, showing up late to my soccer games, or, coming to, some of the weekend meetings we were supposed to have. He, didn't have full custody. And so in all of that time that I hadn't seen him, how did he come to this? And also, the question that I ended up really exploring was, had he really changed? Because as I reunited with him, after some years of estrangement, during this investigation, he swore that that was all in the past, and that, he really had turned a new leaf. And I found that, my father is far and away the most difficult source I've ever had in my career, because, he is equal parts charismatic and intelligent and deceitful and manipulative. And so I really, as a journalist and as a daughter, I had to struggle to figure out, how much of what my father tells me about the past can I trust? And in doing that, I started to interrogate myself and my own motivations in going on this search, and, digging up all of the family secrets, which was also not what most of my family wanted. They really wanted to move forward, and their Roman Catholic ethos was, you forgive your father and you move on, and above all, you don't, as they would put it, go against the family. And I had to reckon with my own guilt over whether I was doing just that, whether I was going against the family by trying to get these answers, and whether I deserved to know everything about who my parents were before they were my parents. And I had to question, whether I could trust myself, let alone trust him. And so I think that in looking back at how the project unfolded, there was a point where journalism, because I really tried really hard to keep my journalism hat on, and to stifle the feelings I was having, the complicated feelings I was having as a daughter. There was a point, where the lines really began to blur, and where I found that, journalism can certainly reveal unseen or previously unfound facts or truth, but there was a point where the records could only get me so far, and it started to become a lot less black and white. Um, and I think that that is one of the central questions at the heart of my book, which is, you know, at what point can you call a lie, and if you finally figure out what the truth is and no one else believes it, does it matter? It's questions like that. So that's the family snitch for you.
Great. Thank you very much. Now over to Jowita. Please tell us about your latest forthcoming book.
Thank you, Chip. Well, just listening to Francesca, I had some ideas that I should insert into my introduction. But for now, my name is Jowita Bydlowska, and I'm author of a couple of books of fiction and a memoir called Drunk Mom. And Unshaming is it's not a follow-up to Drunk Mom. And when I published Drunk Mom and sort of dealt with the reaction of public shaming, among other things, I thought I will never, ever publish another memoir. I cannot deal with this. I cannot deal with the scrutiny. I cannot put myself out there. So I moved into fiction and published 3 books of fiction. What I quickly learned is that people didn't connect with fiction as well. And my background is also in journalism. And I often thought about, going from my undergrad is in psychology, sort of going from the listener to teller, and the sort of overlap between those two things, and and what the obligation of a writer or someone who tells story is. With Drunk Mom, what I did is I used sort of tools to investigate myself in a very imperfect way, trying to mimic what David Carr has done with The Night of the Gun, where I thought I'm going to tell this ruthless truth and I'm going to, go after myself as a subject. And then I did the same thing with Unshaming, or I hope I did. But Unshaming started as a strictly book of nonfiction. So I thought I'm going to use all my journalistic tools. I'm going to investigate, shame as a subject, because this is what lies under, what Drunk Mom was about, which is addiction and relapse and things like that. And then I started doing research. I started, collecting material. I started thinking of people to interview, and it became so overwhelming that I thought I can't really do it proper justice, except in one way, which is to sort of expose myself and treat my own story as a story of shame, and then sort of back that with some psychological research and some commentary on cultures and things like that. So the way we, for example, reacted to women's addiction back when Drunk Mom came out, which was a time of Britney Spears shaving her head and Amy Winehouse screwing up left and right and center. So have things changed in more than 10 years? I'm very curious to see that, when the book comes out, but also, yeah, investigating myself is it was very interesting. And the thing about truth and memoir, and telling these, we are still storytellers at the end of the day, so we still have to tell sort of coherent story. And I'm hoping that's what I did with Shame. Has a much more sort of hopeful arc than my previous memoir had, in that there's the before, there's sort of the present, and there's the after, what happens after I finally get better and deal with things like shame. And when I say get better, I mean overcome my addiction again, because it is also a book about failure and relapsing probably at least 20 times, but also recovering at least 20 times. So, and just one more thing I wanted to add is that I write books that I don't see or can't find. And I did that with Drunk Mom, because I couldn't find any books about, relapsing and disappointing your children and being an alcoholic parent. I use this term to describe myself. And I was looking for that book desperately. And this is similar with Unshaming. I couldn't find any books about, repeated relapses, except for, I think, Elizabeth Wurtzel wrote Again or something. And that was the only book that I knew that was out there about this sort of crazy process. And anyway, sorry. That's all. Thank you.
That's okay. That was great. Thank you very much. And now over to Maria. And I'll also just mention for those who are joining us today that Maria's book was already published in Danish, but Steerforth is excited to be bringing it to the entire English-speaking world. So Maria, please tell us about your experience in your book.
Thank you so much, Chip. And hello, everybody. Yes, so my name is Maria Milland, and I'm an obstetrician gynecologist and a humanitarian. And Born at the Gates of Hell is a narrative / documentary about the 9 months I spent as the only OB-GYN in the Al-Hol camp in northeast Syria, a place where more than 50,000 people, mostly women and children, had been trapped for years under very, very primitive, harsh, and sometimes violent conditions. And even though I had been deployed 10 times before to very challenging humanitarian hotspots across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, nothing prepared me for Al-Hol camp. What I saw there was simply a different caliber of hopelessness and suffering and violence. And after I returned home, the images stayed with me. I couldn't let go of them. And it was a feeling of, can such a place really exist on this earth? And I simply realized I had to tell the world what I had seen. So even though I'm not trained as a journalist or a writer, I felt obliged. I simply had to tell the world what I had seen. And once I decided to write, the book more or less wrote itself. It just poured out of me. And in Born at the Gates of Hell, you will meet the pregnant and laboring woman I cared for while I was in the camp. Women who have very, very limited access to reproductive health care and as a consequence suffer from severe pregnancy complications. And despite this camp's very violent environment and despite these women's obscure background, they trusted me with their stories, not only their medical problems, but also stories, very disturbing stories about their past and about the present. And these women, they give children that begin their life in detention behind high fences, and they live there without any prospect if they will ever be able to leave the Al-Hol camp. And even though the book is rooted in medicine and takes place primarily at the camp's hospital, it's about something much broader and universal. It's about resilience and it's about trust. It's about the power of the human connection, of human interaction. And it's also a book about what it takes or what it means to be a humanitarian doctor and to witness suffering and to be stressed to your limits and sometimes beyond. So in short, it's a book about hope in the middle of hopelessness. It's a book about bringing life to the world in a place where children should not be born nor live.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. So now I want to ask each of you to tell us a story. One of the things that we all know is that reading real literature helps us not only gain a window onto other lives and other cultures, it helps us gain empathy through that process. But we also read because we like to be transported and entertained. And sometimes even reading a scary experience can be entertaining in its way. And so I'd like each of you to start by telling us a story consistent with our risky and vulnerable theme of today's conversation about a situation where you found yourself in a risky moment. And maybe you realized it at the moment and your heart was pounding in your chest and you're wondering how you're going to get out of it. Or it's something that you only realized years later, perhaps even when you were writing your memoir and you gasped or winced and thought, oh my gosh, that could have gone sideways and things could have been very different. So again, we'll start with Francesca, and please tell us a story that appears in your book about when you were at risk.
Sure. So this is actually in the chapter that bears the title of the book, The Family Snitch. I was interviewing attorneys, defense attorneys who'd been involved in the case that my father had been involved in, with the corrupt cops doing fake drug raids and stealing money and drugs from drug dealers. And I was asking them about the case itself, but I was also trying to glean whether any of them knew my father or whether they had any insight to give me. And one of the attorneys was not very happy to see me. And I was probably 21 at the time. This was part of my journalism school and honors college thesis. So I came, under the guise of a student, with a project. And, I sat down and I asked if I could start my tape recorder, and he said no. He wanted to hear my questions. And so then I started to list out all of my questions, and he said, not going to answer that to every single one. And so I'm starting to sweat because I know I have half an hour and I have, a pretty hostile source in front of me. And so he quickly sort of saw that I was floundering and turned the interview onto me. And he started asking questions that, looking back, I had been asking myself. Why was I doing this project again? Because my dad went to prison, however many years ago. And what did I really want from this? Didn't I think that maybe he'd done his time and that everyone wanted to move on? And, you're going back and digging up all of this family drama. And then he asked me the critical question, which is, what? You want to be the family snitch? And I believe I told him no. And after the interview, I really started to spiral, like there on the street in Chicago, making my way back to my hotel room. And a bit of context, I had also, I've been diagnosed with OCD, and obviously I've had it longer than I've known I've had it. But, the way that all of my guilt and shame and worries about what I was doing in searching for the truth about my father was really starting to manifest itself physically, in picking at my skin and sort of as I probably put it in the book, sort of mutilating myself as a way of sort of numbing myself, and as a way of sort of, now I can only see it in hindsight, I think, punishing myself because, every time I won a little battle between, me and my father, getting an interview despite his interference or something else, I didn't feel that I deserved it, just like I was questioning whether I deserved to know anything that I was searching for. And so looking, at that moment was where, I think the the spiral that I was going into really started to ramp up. And, later in the book, I realized that it it would only continue to get worse the longer I kept my father in my life. And so the question, sort of dramatic and silly, in and out of context, really was like, only one of us is going to make it out of this alive, and it's him or me, because I couldn't ignore at a certain point that everything I was throwing, into the relationship with my father really was consuming me. And so and obviously that was not necessarily, uh, physical lack of safety, but certainly that was a turning point in, um, in the ways that I was sort of destroying myself.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And when I think of your book, if there are vivid moments, I think the one that comes to mind first is that day you describe in your hotel room. And just peeking ahead to when we talk about vulnerable in the next part of our conversation, if you hadn't been willing to make yourself vulnerable and share that moment, with your readers, the book would not have the depth that it has. So I'm glad you picked that one. Now, Jowita, I'm eager to hear what story you want to share from your book.
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot. I think the whole book is a risk, and not to, pat myself on the back, but it's a book about telling the truth. And I think, interestingly enough, in terms of sort of health and my physiological reaction to it, the biggest risk was when I finally told my biggest shame to a bunch of people, similarly in a Zoom setting like this. So it wasn't anything, explosive or anything like that, but it was actually just confronting myself and being able to tell the truth. And the book starts, and I know you asked for one story, but in terms of risk, I would say almost every chapter talks about a risk that an active addict takes in their life. So whether it's drinking and not telling your loved ones what you're doing, or whether it's lying about your recovery, whether it's I have a son and sort of putting him at risk, but not so much anymore. I've never been a very, I guess, dangerous drunk, but certainly, breaking our trust over and over. Those are all the risks that, an addict sort of puts against recovery and telling the truth. And so I just went over, I sort of, mentally through all the chapters, and I thought there's one chapter specifically where where I do reveal what the real issue is, and that gave me probably the most physiological reaction. So yeah, I don't know. That's my.
Yeah, no, and there's no, as all three of you know, my wife is a psychotherapist, and that might be one of the reasons that I appreciate so deeply the work all three of you have done. But she especially focused on guilt and shame, and I know how destructive not confronting guilt and shame can be, not only to the individual, but everybody in their lives, and in ways where lives are really on the line. So, it's another reason that I think it's so important that some writers be willing to share with the world honestly and openly what they went through, because almost everybody else who goes through it does it without that kind of, reckoning or honesty. So, and now, Maria, please share with us a story from your book.
Yes, thank you, Chip. Well, just like Jowita, I actually been thinking a lot about this question over the weekend, because the thing is, I felt that my safety was at risk during the whole 9 months I was working at the Al-Hol camp. It's an extremely violent place where the homicide rate is among the highest in the world, and far exceeds what you will find in the neighborhoods that are controlled by the narco cartels in Mexico. But as you know, Chip, this is not so much a book about me. It's a book about the women of Al-Hol. So if you will allow me, I would like to share one of my patient stories. Yeah.
Please.
So this is an Iraqi woman who was admitted to the hospital due to complications following a late miscarriage. And during the follow-up visit, she shares the following. One night, the previous year, she woke up in the middle of the night in her tent, and she was realizing that a sandstorm was picking up outside. The flapping of the tent was loud. She was lying there and she couldn't fall asleep again. She began thinking about that she didn't have enough food for her 12 children. And she's lying there, and then her youngest daughter, who's only a couple of months old, wakes up and starts crying, and quickly she puts the child to her breast to nurse her. And she's finding a moment of comfort looking down at her daughter's mouth sucking away. And suddenly she can hear something outside the tent. And she's like, is that the sound of footsteps? What can that be? Because she knows that very, very few people, they dare to venture outside the tents at night times, and in periods there are regular curfews. But she can hear the sound coming closer, and she's trying to figure out how many footsteps are there. And then suddenly the tent flap is flung aside, and a tall, dark figure, he enters. And he's followed by additional 4 figures. He then turns on a flashlight, and she can see that all the men, they're masked. Black masks are covering their faces and necks, and they're armed. Her daughter starts to cry. Then he points his firearm towards her. And the rest of the men, they are herding the children to the rear of the tent. And then they hold up her grandparents and her husband at gunpoint. The leader, he steps towards the children at the rear of the tent, and he commands, Hamid, come here. And her eldest son, 16 years old, he stands up. He's forced to the center of the tent, where he's forced down on his knees, and then he's shot with 4 bullets right between the eyes. And then the 5 masked men disappear into the night again.
Thank you for sharing that.
So this is not my story, but it's a story I've heard. And there are many, many more of these horror ones in Born at the Gates of Hell. So I want to give them a voice through me rather than sharing my own fear.
Thank you. All right. Now moving on to the vulnerable part, and this is, our audience is librarians, and they are very interested in the writing process and the lives of writers. And in addition to having lived the lives and had the experiences that you felt compelled to write about, and then doing the hard work of getting it on the page. And I know from editing memoirs that includes an unconscious reluctance or resistance to really drill down where things can be the most painful, whether it's an emotional experience or a physical experience. To write about it is hard. But I want you to break new ground now and think about the fact that your books are all going to be coming out to a wide audience soon. And every imaginable person is going to have access to it. Family members, friends you haven't been in touch with for years, people you write about, and then thousands and thousands of strangers. So starting again with Francesca, I'd like you, having been through this vulnerable process of writing a book, what is the prospect of bringing your book out, promoting your book, having other people read your book? What sort of issues does it bring to mind for you as far as the vulnerability theme goes?
Yeah, I think that when I was mulling your question over, my first instinct was to say, I'll just feel so relieved. When it comes to like my own personal vulnerability and my sharing my end of the story, that's something that I think I think it feels like a great relief that it will no longer be sort of on my desk, so to speak, and that it'll be, in this book. Selfishly, because it's really hard to, you know, have any other sort of creative inspiration or endeavors when you're consumed with this one experience. And for me, it was obviously a very pivotal personal one. So anytime I tried to write, if I tried to write a play or a short story, this story was coming out in just a worse form. The thing that really makes me feel trepidation or guilt or shame, one of the themes of this talk clearly, is when I think about the people I've written about. I was very much comfortable with, examining myself and sort of putting myself under the microscope. And I think that in my book, I deal with this directly. I was always questioning, my own motives and whether I deserve to, involve the stories of others. To write a story about my life and my relationship with my father, that's a necessity. But I think about the sort of collateral damage that, I, as, a memoirist, sort of leave in my wake when I'm writing about people who have private lives. And it's sort of it's kind of the other side of the coin of the question of, do I deserve to find out all of these things I seek? This side being, do I deserve to, write this book, which certainly was painful for me personally and also revelatory, but also, am I just sort of selling everyone else out? Because, the less savory side of things is that, I'm telling this story not, as my mother asked me, she was like, why don't you wait till everyone's dead? Once we're all gone, and then you can just write whatever you want. And one of the many reasons I came up with was because it's almost like I feel like a child saying it, but I want it now, and because I feel inspired to do this now. And it's a hell of a story, and I'm a writer. So what am I supposed to do with it? And then, it's kind of this like tennis match back and forth between, basically me playing tennis with myself. Like, okay, but do you deserve that? Or do you need to sort of even the scales in some way? And I think that, it'd be interesting to hear what my fellow panelists think about, being the one to share other people's stories. Obviously, as a memoirist, we think that we're making ourselves vulnerable, but we also kind of hold all the power because we're the ones writing it down. So there's also this great responsibility that comes with, telling stories that are intertwined with the lives of real people.
Thank you. And Jowita, I'm curious because Drunk Mom was published about 10 years ago, so you've kind of gone through this once before, but one of the things I really admired about your new book was the honesty with which you talked about how you're not making any bold claims about having figured it out or gotten beyond things, and that your writing itself reflected these periods where your life was kind of like a hot mess, and then these periods where everything sort of slowed down and settled and you felt okay. But then, over and over, you shared with the reader that it's not linear. So I'm eager to hear what you think is a vulnerable aspect of writing this new book and coming out.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. That's a great observation. Thinking about your question, last week I had an opportunity to finish recording audiobook for UNSHAMING. So I was sort of looking into like, where was my voice breaking the most? Like which chapters were making me the most vulnerable? And I thought it would be one specific chapter that's about something quite traumatic that I witnessed. But it wasn't that. It was kind of the whole time realized like my voice was breaking all the time. So I had to do a lot of repeats, but it was thinking and talking in a book about coming back to to exposing myself again, and after more than a decade. But the thing about it is, the whole premise of the book is, shame lives in secrecy, and the way we get rid of it is by telling someone about it. I didn't have to tell the whole world about my shames, but also, again, there was no other way to address this issue. So I had to go into a place sort of internally where, unless I was absolutely terrified, I had no business telling the story. And when I say terrified, I'm not saying physical danger. I'm talking about terrified of judgment, because shame is all based on judgment of others. I'm talking about toxic shame, not healthy shame. So unless I was not, to some point, really worried and really terrified, I wasn't writing about it. So for that reason, I picked only stories that I think were vulnerable. And in terms of other people, of course, I did think about it. I did check in with them, because I had this experience with my previous memoir, where I saw what people got upset about, and I have to say, people get upset about the strangest things. So with this book, I had this opportunity to sort of check in with people, mostly my son, who's 16 years old now, and I shared with him what I've written about, and my partner at the time. So I had their okay, and I'm very lucky for that. I have been threatened with 3 lawsuits now, with my fictions, surprisingly. So I've experienced the idea of what offends people on a completely different level. But with this one, yeah, I mean, the book is sort of almost like a live book. Publishing it is part of the book, part of the sort of vulnerability, and part of seeing what people will react to it and how they will react to it. I don't have some great martyr complex. I don't need to perform this open heart surgery on myself in order to tell the story. But at the same time, is there other way? I really, for me, there wasn't. So yeah,
It's great. Thank you very much. And Maria, what do you have to say on the topic of vulnerability in your book coming out to English language readers?
Yes, because as you said, it was published in Danish, almost 2 years ago, and I was very, very nervous. I remember before it was released, because, as I said initially, I'm not trained as a writer or journalist, but I had this story. I felt an obligation to share with the world. It was not so much a question if I wanted to or if I could. I had to do it. It would not leave me. I was almost, obsessed with this story. And in the book, I give a human face to the people that the world largely has turned its back on. These people, they are forsaken. We just keep them inside a detention camp, basically because we don't know what to do with them. And some of them have assumed affiliation with Islamic State, but we don't even know it because they have not been to court. They have not had the chance to defend themselves. But in my book, I give them a human face. I show that they have a body. They can fall ill. They can fall pregnant. They can suffer pregnancy complications. They can give birth to children just like anybody else. So in fact, I was very afraid that the critics would condemn me for not condemning them, because they are out there, that I have chosen to highlight our shared humanity instead of saying us and them. And of course, now when it's coming out to the English-speaking audience, which is much larger, that vulnerability comes back, because what will the critics say this time around? And this time there's also a new layer to my vulnerability, because, as you know, I have self-translated the book. And have I succeeded in giving my narrative a voice, and how will it be received? I'm very nervous about it, but let's see in a couple of months.
Great, thank you. Now we do have about 8 more minutes for our conversation, and especially because we have 2 journalists and a diagnostician on the panel. I'm curious to if all of you have either questions of each other or additional thoughts about your own work that came to mind while hearing the other panelists speak. So please, anybody.
Yeah, I could mirror in what Jowita, you said that when you wrote the book, you researched that there was no book written yet on alcoholic parents that had a relapse. Was that it?
So that was with my first book more than 10 years ago. And then with this one,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to find when I was going through it was a book about repeated relapse. So, or in other words, someone failing repeatedly, because we have this love for stories that have a happy ending. And I'm sure like you've experienced that with, you know, with what you've written about, that there's no happy ending sometimes. And sometimes stories just
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's the book I was looking for, and I thought it's not out there, so I'm going to write it. I'm sure there is in another language, or I haven't come across it yet. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's just like, you know, I can hear that you have done your research, and I could mirror in that because it was the same thing I did when I came back from the alcohol camp. I researched, is there already a book on the alcohol camp? And no, there was none, even though that this camp has received massive media attention. No book was written. So I was like, okay, if it's not written yet, I will do it. Yeah.
I have a question for Francesca, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm wondering, I'm wondering in terms of going from, being a journalist and telling other stories to telling your own story. How are you preparing for that? Or what are your fears? Or do we need to talk privately?
No. This is a great question. And it was a big part, going into the reporting process of the book, sort of the present timeline, so to speak, of the book. When I'm this, optimistic, sort of journalism student trying to say, I can report on my father just as objectively as I report on everything else, and then realizing that that just comes crumbling down. I told someone recently who's a writer about that process, and she was like, "Yeah, so how'd that work out?" And I was like, "Great, no, it's horrible." And I think that when I was writing the book, I I had a similarly delineated sides of myself. I think that I just started to allow them to, I guess, affect each other a little bit. For instance, I rigorously fact checked my book, but it just looks different when it's, when it's a piece of journalism versus when I'm, footnoting my, a passage I've written with the, primary evidence being like a journal entry or a receipt I found in one of the many boxes behind me. So I think, the book was definitely informed and couldn't exist without my training and like, the journalist side of me. I think that the thing that's the biggest challenge is learning to talk about myself, because especially, I work at the Wall Street Journal, and, we're firm believers, and, we are not the story. The story is, what we're reporting. And so that's an interesting element. And I think also, having colleagues, I've given advanced copies to a couple of my colleagues, and the warning I give them is like, when I come back and you see me next, I'll look different, because once you've read, someone's work that's so vulnerable, you get to know them very quickly. And I was wondering what was your experience, after maybe not the difference between journalist and writer, but, did that change or affect, how you felt like you were seen in your personal circles?
Yeah, and I was just going to comment on something, because we are taught in journalism schools that the story is not about us, right? So even personal journalism was such a no-no when I was graduating from school, and it's like, you don't put I in a story. And I went into journalism school because I wanted to write fiction. I wanted to write made-up stories, and I had no other ideas how to write. And then I ended up writing about myself, but also, as I said, like I try to treat it as a sort of journalistic subject in terms of rigorous honesty and truth and fact-checking, etc. Mostly approximated dialogue and things like that. But the training certainly helped. And yeah, the one thing, and I was thinking, Maria, maybe struggle, but I'm curious to know, is that the one thing with me is I feel so incredibly self-centered and selfish when I'm like, oh, I'm a memoirist and I wrote about myself again, like in my case. So you haven't said at all, Maria, I just wanted to bounce the question back to you. If you are in the story at all, and how you figure in it and how you're dealing with that.
Yeah, I am in the story. It's a narrative, so it's written in first person singular. Except the prologue, which is in third person singular, because the Al-Hol camp, it's such a sensitive topic that I found out the only way I could take responsibility for my writing was to make it a narrative and to make it I. So I've been discussing a lot with Chip all these I and me and mine, because I wanted to delete some of them, and he was like, no, it has to be there. And as I said before, I'm not trained as a writer, but it was just my feeling. It has to come from me, what I'm seeing, what I'm witnessing there. And of course, I have taken many precautions to protect the people, because they are anonymized, so you will not be able to recognize who it is. And also the sequence of things, how they happen, I have also adjusted a bit. But the story is there. The story is there. It's the story of the woman of Al-Hol. And in fact, I have dedicated the woman or the book to the woman, it says simply, because it's their book. They don't have a voice. I have a voice. So I try to give them a voice through me as a doctor. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I would also like to add the observation, Maria, that just as journalists have subjects, doctors have subjects, that they try to be as objective about as they can, and yet the human element is undeniable, and it colors the story, and it really is what is the animating factor in all three of your books. So we're really coming to the end of our time. So on that, I'm going to thank all three of you for being here today, and look forward to your books coming out in the spring. And there are two terrific panels coming up right after this one. And I hope you will be able to pick one that suits you best, and stay tuned. So thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.